Stan Houston for Church of Democratic Enlightenment. This is the fifth talk, 1E, in my series Agenda, Free Speech, You Are Silencing Them, analysing the program Agenda, Free Speech at What Cost. This talk is entitled Evasion because it examines the practice adopted in the program by Professor Alice McLaughlin, York University in Canada, of consistently offering different definitions or conceptions of terms and processes from Professor Janice Fiamengo and Justin Trottier, her opponents in the debate, and whom I support. McLaughlin, supported in the debate by Rachel DeCoste, seems to offer us the choice of either accepting an alternative universe or concluding that she must constantly shift from common ground to conceal that her views have no rational credibility. 1. What we mean by free speech. Fiamengo objects to being shut down by the pulling of fire alarms as a violation of free speech. McLaughlin says, quote, "I think it's important to talk about what we mean by free speech. I care a lot about free speech. Free speech means freedom from government interference and sanctions," close quote. McLaughlin explains that free speech, quote, "doesn't mean freedom from consequences, which can mean that the debate doesn't happen," close quote. So anyone except the government can shut down debate and it's still free speech. The university policy to which Trottier refers, quote, "a free speech policy on the non-disruption of sanctioned events," close quote, appears according to McLaughlin to be incorrectly named or conceived, since university students disrupting or shutting down speakers with no government involvement would be freedom of speech. 2. We have to be very careful not to confuse criticism with control. Fiamengo says she has no problems with vigorous criticism of views, but that to say that shutting down an invited speaker at the university, quote, "doesn't somehow count as a suppression of free speech" seems absolutely nonsensical, close quote. McLaughlin argues that criticism of views is not the right issue. Open quote, "I think we have to be very careful not to confuse criticism with control. So you are suggesting you are perfectly open to criticism so long as you get to control the manner in which it happens," close quote. The nature of Fiamengo's control over a situation in which her talk is shut down by fire alarms, action which all panellists reject, is not made clear. Later references by Fiamengo to disruptors beating drums and blowing horns, and by Trottier to students blocking doors to her talks, and violations of university policy, further obscure the nature of Fiamengo's control of the situation. McLaughlin's claim of Fiamengo's confusing criticism with control clearly means there shouldn't be enough control for Fiamengo to speak. That is all Fiamengo argues for. 3. There was absolutely debate. I witnessed it. McLaughlin continues her theme of Fiamengo's wanting to control criticism, explaining that the protesters were, quote, "using every venue possible to them to debate vigorously," end quote. Fiamengo interjects, "There was no debate," presumably referring to the sort of case McLaughlin has mentioned earlier where the debate doesn't happen, like at Ottawa University, where Fiamengo was shut down by the fire alarms and the question and answer session was eliminated. Fiamengo is evidently wrong about there being no debate. McLaughlin says there was absolutely debate. I witnessed it. I don't think you get to decide what counts as debate, close quote. McLaughlin's view is evidently that she can decide what counts as debate and Fiamengo can't. Moderator Pakin seems to think it should be possible to find agreement on an acceptable form of debate. He says, quote, "Everybody shouts at everybody at the same time. Is that a reasonable debate?" McLaughlin, "Is it a reasonable debate? Not necessarily. Is it a debate? Yes." Pakin persists with desirable and constructive. Quote, "A speaker speaks, audience asks questions afterwards in a civil atmosphere. Is it the only constructive way?" McLaughlin, "I don't even think it's the only constructive way. I think we need to look at the history of civil disobedience and protest." 4. An alternate voice got called a control. DeCoste suggests that speakers such as Ann Coulter, who she opposes, should have, quote, "an antidote or fact-checker checking her every time she said something that makes no sense and giving the alternate explanation. That's a debate. Trottier refers to what de Coste proposes as a control, and McLaughlin objects to this, but in doing so changes what de Coste proposes. McLaughlin says, quote, "I think it's interesting that an alternate voice got called a control there. So Rachel proposed that if Ann Coulter came to speak, there should be two people speaking representing different perspectives." Close quote. McLaughlin's two people speaking representing different perspectives sounds like a standard debate format, something quite different from de Coste's antidote or fact checker, etc., a debate format previously unheard of, to my knowledge. That de Coste didn't say an opposing speaker seems to confirm this. 5. I would certainly not frame it in terms of freedom of speech. Fiamengo asked McLaughlin whether if McLaughlin had her talks shut down, quote, "Would you say this was a wonderful example of freedom of speech if you'd never got to say your first sentence?" End quote. McLaughlin, "I would certainly not frame it in terms of freedom of speech." As to how McLaughlin would feel if every time she tried to speak, as Fiamengo puts it to her, quote, "students decided you shouldn't be allowed to speak," close quote, McLaughlin says, quote, "I would feel shocked and I would feel hurt," continuing to argue that these consequences of being prevented from speaking for saying things her audience found hurtful would include, quote, "rethink some of what you are saying," close quote. To McLaughlin, preventing someone from speaking till they change their views does not raise an issue of free speech. 6. Is getting on agenda free speech or not? Following McLaughlin's reply, I certainly would not frame it in terms of freedom of speech, to Fiamengo's concern at being shut down, McLaughlin continues in her same comment, quote, "If that led to a much wider platform for my views, including an entire episode of the agenda being dedicated to them, I'd probably be pretty pleased," end quote. Earlier, McLaughlin had described people, quote, "yelling, not always being polite," and as a result, I know that Janice's work has received a much wider audience, including a platform on this show, so I think this is how a society of free speech works, end quote. Things which lead to appearing on agenda are thus to McLaughlin not to be framed in terms of freedom of speech and how a society of free speech works. Agenda's free speech topic is different from Fiamengo's talks on radical feminism. 7. I absolutely believe that. Fiamengo asked McLaughlin about the university's purpose. Quote, "If university is not about the place where you work through ideas in a rational way, not through emotion, not through shouting, not through accusation, where you challenge what you believe to be false with evidence, if you don't believe that, what is the university for?" McLaughlin replies, "I absolutely believe that." It is clear we can see this as contradicting McLaughlin's support for yelling, not always being polite, and other emotional reaction. However, her "I absolutely believe that" can be seen as sincere only provided the ideas Fiamengo says you work through in a rational way with evidence do not include what other university departments like women's studies are teaching. McLaughlin says that Fiamengo's claims, quote, "are often specious arguments based on little evidence or are twisted to be provocative," close quote, which evidently justifies shutting them down rather than working through them in a rational way. The exemption from criticism would apply across the whole university sector, Fiamengo and McLaughlin being at different universities. 8. There isn't always a clear distinction between ideas and people. McLaughlin again brilliantly strikes at the democratic heart of debate. People have the physical power and autonomous will to forcibly suppress ideas and coerce opponents. Ideas are, as dictionary.com tells us, quote, "any conception existing in the mind as a result of mental understanding, awareness or activity," close quote. Even the ideas most closely associated with people, Pythagoras' theorem, Archimedes' principle, Platonic love, Reaganomics, cannot possibly be confused with the associated person of physical presence, a life history including thousands of events and other ideas, a unique individual personality, and so on. McLaughlin says, quote, "There isn't always a clear distinction between ideas and people. It wasn't ideas who rushed the stage, it was people who were directly hurt by the effects of this program," end quote. This refers to when an earlier agenda program was put off air by protesters rushing the stage. By Pakin's account, the only expression of the ideas of the people concerned was on a banner they unrolled, as DeCoste actually describes it, in, quote, bumper sticker, close quote, form. That people being hurt by ideas justifies this reaction means that wherever there is disagreement with the hurtful power of opposing ideas, there can be no debate. Please retweet, follow and share. Thanks.